Hello and welcome to today's pre-concert talk. I'm very excited to be here, not only to talk about Tamerlano, but also to see today's production. By 1724, Handel had overcome his rival Bononcini to become the director and principal supplier of operas to the Royal Academy of Music, a company whose purpose was to supply London with Italian operas. And it was in 1724 that he revived his masterpiece, Giulio Cesare, which some of you might have seen here in Göttingen a few years ago. And he created two new ones, Rodelinda and Tamerlano. This period presents itself as a starting point in the search for an exemplary Academy opera. These are themselves categorized as representing Handel's mature Italian opera style. So we're moving towards the end of Handel's career in creating Italian operas. Tamerlano opened the Royal Academy's sixth season and saw the London debut of Pacini, Borsini and Dotti, as you see here. Both Senesino and Cuzzoni featured regularly in the casts of the theatre in the Haymarket, where the Royal Academy was based. And it's noteworthy here that Senesino had not claimed the title role of Tamerlano, who was the self-made ruler of the Tatar Empire, but he had let it go to the considerably less famous Andrea Pacini, who was only to have a short career in London. Senesino was quite possibly, however, more suited to play the role of the lover. The two castrati had to share the vocal honours in this opera with a tenor, however, in the major role of Bayezid, the Turkish sultan, and Tamerlano's main adversary. And this is possibly one of the most significant tenor roles in all of opera seria. Now, the London public was very familiar with the story of Tamerlano. A play by Nicholas Rowe called Tamerlane of 1701 was widely considered to have political overtones concerning William III and Louis XIV. And after 1716, it was performed every year on the 4th and the 5th of November at both Drury Lane and Lincoln's Inn Fields theatres as a commemoration of William III's landing at Torbay on the 5th of November, 1688. So, in fact, there's at least one performance of Tamerlano that happened on the same day as the play was performed. And I'm sure there's no coincidence in that at all. According to Handel's note at the end of the autograph, and he's very helpful in dating his autograph scores, they are a great source of information for us. He began Tamerlano in London on the 3rd of July, 1724, and he finished it on the 23rd. This is a short period, but not unusual for Handel. And if you read anything about Handel's compositional process, it was very normal for him to compose a whole opera or oratorio in the space of 3 weeks. The libretto was an adaptation by Nicola Hain of Agostino Piovene's Tamerlano, Tragedia per Musica, which had been set originally by Francesco Gasparini and performed in Venice in 1711. Now, clearly, Handel was not satisfied with this original draft, for over the next couple of months, he rearranged, cut, and recomposed large portions of the score, all before the first performance at the King's Theatre on the 31st of October, 1724. These changes were so radical that a fresh performing score had to be written very late in the proceedings to replace an earlier performing score, which is now lost. And even this second performing score was amended at the last minute. So what Handel did was he would write the autograph, and that itself would have lots of alterations and amendments and pages inserted and pages torn out. And almost at the same time, his copyist would be copying out a neat copy of the autograph score that the conductor, mostly Handel himself, could conduct from. And this is what we call the performing score. A lot of the time, the performing scores are almost as valuable as the autographs for finding out how a piece was composed, because in the performing score, Händel would also make changes. So he would also cross passages out and insert new pages. And this is how we often are able to date later versions of arias and recitatives and so on. Now, there were several reasons why revisions were necessary. The first was the familiar one of a change of cast. The role of Irene was first conceived for a soprano. Then much of it had to be rewritten to accommodate the contralto voice of Anna Dotti, who sang it in the first performance. This is quite normal for the times. The second was the result of the arrival in London from Vienna early in September of the tenor Francesco Borsoni, or Borsini rather, who had been engaged to sing Baiese. Händel composed the part before he heard Borsini sing, and soon discovered that he had miscalculated. Borsini's voice was clearly unsuited to a tessitura above F or G. So a lot of what Händel had already written had to be rewritten or transposed to suit the lower range of Borsini's voice. Again, Händel was quite used to doing this. This was quite standard procedure. Borsini's arrival, however, had a much more dramatic consequence. He must have brought with him a manuscript score of Gasparini's setting of the Tamerlano story, Il Baiese Dramma per Musica, in which Borsini had sung the role of Tamerlano 5 years earlier. The original Pioveni libretto had been substantially rewritten by Ippolito Zanella and other writers, although there is evidence that the magnificent scene of Baiese's death, which is the most striking improvement on the earlier libretto, was inspired by Borsini himself. As well as a copy of the Gasparini score, Borsini must have brought to London a copy of the printed libretto. As soon as Händel saw the 1719 version, he realised that it offered a better and more dramatic text for the opening and closing scenes of the opera, and some less significant improvements elsewhere. Radical alterations were now made to the opera, as Händel grafted pieces of the 1719 libretto onto Nicola Haim's original adaptation of Pioveni, and composed a lot of new music. The corrections did not stop with the copying of the second performing score either. More changes were made at the last minute. And this is evidence of the enormous care that Händel lavished on this work, more so even than many of his other works. So this is where it starts to get unusual. It may, in fact, be a unique phenomenon in the history of the opera that a composer should undertake a major revision of an already completed score because he had come across a different version of the libretto. One can only sort of begin to imagine the amount of work that must have taken place. Now, Händel's use or reuse of material from his own and others' works is a well-documented part of his compositional process. And Tamerlano follows Händel's usual practice. So Händel borrows in a huge variety of ways. Sometimes he'll borrow a whole aria and just rework the words. Sometimes he'll borrow a harmonic sequence. Sometimes a little motif and completely rework it. And he is as free with his use of his own music as he is with music of others. Sometimes, as in Tamerlano, we see many of borrowings from his own works. There is no significance really that we've traced in whether he uses other people's works or his own. It was just an endemic part of his compositional process. So material in the opera can be traced back to several works by Reinhard Kaiser, one of Händel's favourite composers. But the majority of the borrowings does come from Händel's own works, from various cantatas, the German arias, and operas and oratorios, including Teseo, Agrippina, Il trionfo del tempo, La resurrezione, Rinaldo, Radamisto, Ottone, Rodrigo, Giulio Cesare, Il Pastofido, and Riccardo Primo. So quite a few there, but bear in mind that some of these will be very small borrowings. One other thing of note concerns a minor detail, but an interesting one nonetheless. We don't often talk about Handel's orchestra. We know quite a lot about it thanks to lists from the theatres of who played when and where. And it's interesting to see a handwritten note on the first oboe part, not of Tamerlano, but of 6 spurious trio sonatas that were attributed to being composed by Handel in his early years, but which we know now are not. But this handwritten note on the first oboe part tells us that an oboist and flautist named Carl Friedrich Wiedemann played in the orchestra at the premiere of Tamerlano. But several arias in which the oboe plays are in B-flat minor, and this is a key that would have been restricted against the instrument as it existed at the time. So in other words, the oboe at the time didn't really play in B-flat minor. It was a very hard key, given how the instrument was at the time. And more interestingly, the original oboe part in Tamerlano is actually in A minor, while the rest of the score and the parts are in B-flat minor. And this means that Wiedemann, or possibly another unknown oboist, must have played on a specific oboe that had been developed by the oboist Kitsch for use in the Chapel Royal, where the pitch was higher than the theatre. And from this, we can deduce that Kitsch's oboe was actually used as a transposing instrument in the opera house. So that gives us this really interesting little window into practices of the time. We're not aware of huge crossover between the Chapel Royal and the theatres, except in terms of the players. And so I guess it's not surprising that Kitsch would say to Wiedemann, "I've got this great oboe, do you want to try it?" And Handel thinks, "Oh yes, brilliant, that means I can compose in B-flat minor suddenly. I can bring a new colour." I'd love to have heard it. So what about the plot? Well, Tamerlano, a man of humble birth, who has risen by conquest to rule the vast Tatar Empire in Central Asia, has defeated the Turks in battle and captured their emperor, Bayezid. Among his allies is a Greek prince, Andronico. Tamerlano, though betrothed to Irene, princess of Trebizond, whom he has never seen, and Andronico have each, unknown to the other, fallen in love with Bayezid's daughter, Asteria. This is fairly common, of course, for Handel plots. The all-powerful emperor asks Andronico to plead his cause with Asteria, promising him, in return, the hand of Irene and the restoration of Byzantine power. Again, it's quite common that women are used as sort of pawns in the exchange of power at this point. He also promised to free Bayezid, who, in despair at his defeat, desires only death. Shocked by Andronico's speech, Asteria pretends to accept Tamerlano's love, which horrifies Bayezid. But this is only a way for Asteria to get near the tyrant, whom she tries to assassinate. The murder attempt having, of course, failed, the furious Tamerlano swears that he will have Asteria and her father, Bayezid, killed. Then, recovering himself, he renews his offer of the first act, only to have it rejected by Andronico, who proclaims his own love for Asteria. It seems quite an odd plot twist now for us to have the person you love try to assassinate you, and then you threaten to kill her and her father, and then you say, actually, no, it's okay, I'll marry you instead. But again, this is fairly standard fare. So you have to suspend any disbelief. Once again, Tamerlano swears to be revenged. During a banquet, Asteria, who's now a slave, tries to poison the emperor, whose life is saved by Irene's intervention. The condemnation of Asteria drives Bayezid to suicide. Thus will he escape Tamerlano's power. In a long monologue, the dying sultan calls on the Furies to take vengeance on Tamerlano for him. But this death has calmed the emperor, who decides to give his pardon, to restore Asteria to Andronico and to marry Irene. It's a really neat ending, really, although one does feel a bit sorry for Bayezid. Now, the libretto in its final form bears little sign of its rather tangled history. It's an outstandingly powerful specimen of this dynastic type, whose conventions must, of course, be accepted, however we see them today. This is a world of sharp social distinctions and diplomatic marriages. Irene despises Asteria as a slave, although she is the daughter of an ex-emperor. Bayezid despises Tamerlano as the son of a shepherd. Monarchs are accustomed to make alliances of convenience, and Tamerlano does not know his destined bride by sight. So despite a few deviations and willful twists to the intrigue, which are as usual, they're less confusing in the theatre than on paper, the plot moves forward steadily and with reasonable consistency. The situations are strong and well motivated, the language free from obscurity, poetic conceit, and abstract vapour. The persons, instead of comparing themselves to steersmen or rivers, react to each other in the arias as well as the recitatives. And this is quite unusual for opera of the time, where all the action takes place in the recitative and the arias are purely for describing the character's emotional state. So it's quite advanced in that way. The story doesn't require an extensive knowledge of previous events before becoming comprehensible. Above all, the characters, especially Bayezid and Asteria, but not excluding Tamerlano, Andronico and Irene, give abundant scope to Handel's dramatic genius. Tamerlano's change of heart in the last scene might not easily convince a modern audience, but this was a convention, again, that wasn't to be disturbed. And Handel turns it to a positive advantage by standing it on its head. Throughout the opera, there's this claustrophobic ring of tangled emotions that grips all the main characters. And this is how they are bound inextricably to each other, which makes for a very powerful sense of drama and narrative. Now, Tamerlano is unique among Handel operas in that the entire action takes place within the oppressive ambience of the tyrant's palace. There are none of those open-air episodes, whether of pageantry or pastoral poetry, which are ubiquitous and refreshing features elsewhere. So we never quite escape from what might seem a rather grim atmosphere of Bayezid's dungeon in the opening scene. So at least 3 scenes, the throne room in Act 2, the supper table in Act 3, and Bayezid's death, 2 of which are due to Piovene and 1 to Borrosini, are constructed with great care to reach climaxes of a rather tensile strength that's exceptional in opera seria. Handel raised all 3 of these scenes to a higher degree, not only by the quality of his music, but by subtle adjustments to the libretto. It's noteworthy that after the first performance, he cut nothing from the recitative of these 3 long scenes, except 8 lines for Leone and Irene early in Act 2, Scene 4. And that was in the 1731 revival, when London audiences were wearying of Italian opera, and Handel made drastic cuts in other parts of the opera. Another noteworthy point is the relaxation of the exit convention. And this is when characters exit with a flourish at the end of an aria. You'll be familiar with these. There's a great sort of end to the aria and they storm off stage. So that's what we call an exit aria. In Act 3, only 2 arias are followed by the singer's exit. But there are no fewer than 8 exits without arias. Admittedly, some of these were caused by pre-performance cuts. But the main motive is clearly the demands of dramatic truth. So Handel's moving towards more of a realistic enactment, as he sees it, of these conventions. Conversely, at the end of Act 2, he makes brilliantly positive use of the exit convention. After the trio, Bayezid, Andronico and Irene go out in turn, not with an aria, but with a short arietta, leaving Asteria, who has turned the tables on them, to end the act alone with a full aria. And it seems that likely that this unusual plan, a theatrical masterstroke of the very first order, was suggested by Pioveni by a similar device in an earlier Handel opera. Act 2 of Agrippina, which Pioveni would most likely have seen, has an important scene that's identical in design, though the emotional situation is reversed. Now, Agrippina was produced in Venice around New Year 1710 and was immensely successful. Pioveni wrote his Tamerlano for the same city barely a year later, and it was a rare irony that was brought to Handel's attention many years afterwards in London. So, what about the characterizations? As always in Handel's operas, the characterizations are really what binds the opera together. And I've already mentioned the sort of the claustrophobic atmosphere that really combines these characters, but they also have their own complexity. Handel's ability to portray often complex characters through music is clear throughout his dramatic works. As I've already said, his treatment of the characters in Tamerlano extends beyond the individuals to form a complex emotional web within the narrative. So we see each character as a single person in sort of 3 dimensions, but we also see how their interactions with the other characters combine to make an overall sort of circle. And it's interesting to compare, actually, with the previous 2 libretti, his balancing of the characters via the allocation of arias, which is what you see here. So you can see from the slide here that in 1711, Asteria had by far the largest part, but by 1719, she and Irene had the same number of arias. And that tells us quite a lot about the pacing of the narrative. And the sort of order of characters that Handel places. He places them in a particular order to really fulfill the dramatic sort of expectations demanded by the story. So, who are these characters? Perhaps surprisingly, Tamerlano is not really the villain of the piece. Perhaps this is why his entirely villainous output is achieved by the medium of recitative, which doesn't really prove the most convincing of vehicles for evil. He's only got 1 aria in a minor key. So Tamerlano is portrayed really one who is more used to commanding than pleading. And some of his arias and recitatives actually sound quite jaunty. So let's just have a listen to one of them. This is Voda Pace. So you can hear there, particularly the bass line, those repeated, well, no, we don't want to hear it again. Those repeated octaves, leaps, they are significant because they promote this idea that Tamerlano is not really the sort of evil autocrat. In fact, he's quite a jovial autocrat, if you can have such a thing. And we hear this again in Bella Gara. So he's really quite cheery. We get a glimpse of the tyrant scorned in his snarling music in the trio. And it's significant too that he doesn't really have a love aria. In fact, we see the real reason for his wanting to marry Asteria, ownership rather than love, is made obvious in Dami Paci. So there, the motifs of the violins are significant. They interrupt the lyrical line with these short, almost ironical figurations, clearly implying the superficial element of Tamerlano's feelings. Bayezid, by contrast, is the real hero of the opera, a great tragic figure. His character is a compound of pride, obstinacy, tenderness, fearless courage, and contempt for a weakness in any form. The struggle between his pride and his devotion to Asteria has immense grandeur. His insistence on looking death squarely in the face gives his end a rather Shakespearean sense of purgation. From the first few bars after the overture, he dominates the stage. And it's interesting that Handel gives him several leitmotifs. For example, a pause after an emphatic first word, a chromatically rising or falling bass, thus giving his music, and therefore character, a sense of unity. In a similar fashion, Handel also uses the music to portray and make sense of the apparent contradictions in Bayezid's character. Forte e lieto, for example, states the core of his predicament, his readiness for death, did it not involve separation from Asteria, in a slow C major aria. A lesser composer might have established explicit contrasts to represent the two sides of his predicament, but Handel so concentrates the expression that the emotional pull is felt in every bar, and many details contribute to this. We have the antithesis of syncopation and slurred semiquavers in bars 3 and 4, and often later the poignancy and Bach-like flavour of the diminished seventh arpeggio over a pedal in bar 4, the abrupt switches between major and minor, the steep dynamic contrast. The list goes on. Let's have a listen. You'll have to enjoy more of that later. So Asteria's music is scarcely less memorable than Bayezid's. She has much of her father's spirit, courage, and inner strength, tempered by a hint of waywardness and softened by her love for Andronico. Her vitality is, of course, fired by youth and not simply by outraged honour. Asteria's opening arias in Act 1 are slow and intensely emotional in the minor key. Although the words of each express a measure of scorn for Andronico's apparent faithlessness, Handel, with his instinctive response to nuances of character, subordinates this to something not explicit in the text, that is, nevertheless, alongside her devotion to her father, the key to her actions, and that's love for Andronico. This aria establishes this from the start. It's one of Handel's loveliest Sicilianos. Perhaps the most exquisite touch is the use of highest notes for the words traditor and perfido ingagnator, thus setting up this counterpoint of emotions. So the music expresses not indignation, but the pain and longing of love. Again, in the interest of time, I'll let you enjoy it in the opera. Andronico cuts a rather sorry figure by contrast, admiring Bagliese and in love with Asteria, but knowing that he's at the mercy of Tamerlano. He's a lover rather than a soldier, but he reveals his passions only to the audience, an introvert who enjoys his own sufferings, rather like Bertoldo in Rodelinda. He's not uninteresting as a character, though, and he's magnificently served by his music, particularly when he confronts Tamerlano openly in Se non mi rendi. By contrast, Irene is clearly a woman with a strong sense of honour and duty, a straightforward person whose judgment and actions are unclouded by emotions or devious thoughts. She does, however, undergo something of a transformation with the dawning realisation of hope, depicted gloriously by Händel in Perché mi nasca. As always with the obbligato arias in Handel's works, he uses the distance between the voice and the obbligato part beautifully. In this case, there are many thirds and sixths, which is a very consonant interval, so it gives a great sense of peace throughout the aria. Now, after its premiere, Tamerlano received 9 performances up to the 28th of November, and 3 more towards the end of the season in May 1725. Its reception seems to have been mixed, with Lady Bristol writing to her husband after the first night, "You know my ear too well for me to pretend to give you any account of the opera. Farther than that, the new man takes extremely. But the woman is so great a joke that there was more laughing at her than at a farce. But her opinion of herself gets the better of that. The royal family were all there, and a greater crowd than ever I saw." So clearly, opinions of the musicians or the singers and the music didn't get in the way of having a good night at the opera. The references are probably to Borsellino and certainly to Dotti. I'm sure, of course, that none of tonight's singers will provoke a reaction like that. Händel only revived Tamerlano once, and the first modern revival took place in 1924 at Karlsruhe in a German version by Rudolf and Roth. This was revised for Leipzig in 1925 and used again, sometimes modified, in a number of other German opera houses up to 1962. And I'm afraid that here we must end because time is up and we all need to make our way to our seats, of course. Thank you very much for coming and listening, and I hope that you enjoy tonight's performance as much as I know I am going to. Thank you.